Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story.
The night settles over the silent empires, where leadership is measured in patience and power is exercised without display. Tonight, we turn to Tommy Gagliano, the reserved patriarch whose steady hand, careful judgment, and unwavering discipline helped shape New York's underworld through decades of quiet control. His influence wasn't loud or reckless. It flowed through tradition, structure, and decisions made slowly, always in silence. Before we begin, tap that like button. We're aiming for 100 likes tonight, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these whispered stories alive in the stillness of the night. Now lean back, breathe slow, and let the story of Tommy Gagliano guide you deeper into the quiet. Imagine an old brick house on a quiet New Jersey street, sometime in the late 1940s. The lawn is clipped, the curtains drawn, the mailbox painted, the same as every other home on the block. Children ride their bicycles past that house every afternoon, never slowing, never guessing that inside lives a man who once sat at tables with some of the most feared figures in New York. To them, he is just another gray-haired immigrant who minds his business, a man who walks to the corner store, nods politely, and never raises his voice. Yet behind that closed door lives the story of someone who helped shape a hidden world. Decisions he made in hushed rooms touched thousands of lives, most of them never hearing his name. He preferred it that way. While others chased fame, he chose shadows. Even among men who lived outside the law, he was known for staying quiet, keeping his face out of newspapers, and letting louder personalities take credit and blame. This is the life of Tommy Gagliano, told not to praise him but to understand how a boy from a small Sicilian town became one of the most discreet leaders of organized crime in America. It is a story of poverty and ambition, of choices made step by step, until turning back became almost impossible. As you listen, remember, these are real events drawn from history and investigations, and they show a world that damaged many lives, including those who helped build it. Long before that modest New Jersey house, there was a dusty road in Corleone, Sicily. No bright neon, no noise of streetcars, only hills, stone houses, and fields that seemed to demand more work than they ever gave back in food. In the early 1880s, when Thomas Gagliano was born there, the town sat under a sun that could be both gentle and unforgiving. Families survived on what they could pull from the soil, what they could trade, and whatever small opportunities came through that isolated corner of the island. Records from that time are thin, but the world he entered is better known. Corleone had long been a place where formal law felt distant. People relied on family, on neighbors, and on quiet understandings to solve disputes. Suspicion of outsiders ran deep. If authorities came asking questions, residents learned to say very little. This habit of silence, this instinct to keep problems within a circle of trusted people, was part of the air children breathed there. The Gagliano family, like many in town, faced limited choices. Schooling was short, work started early. A boy learned to keep his eyes open, his head down, and his ear tuned to small shifts in tone from adults around him. If there was tension, he learned not to ask why. This way of living taught caution early, and it stayed with him for the rest of his life. By the turn of the century, stories of America flowed into Corleone like messages from another planet. Letters arrived from cousins and neighbors who had crossed the ocean and now wrote about streets full of pushcarts, jobs in factories, and wages that, while low, seemed high compared to the almost nothing at home. Young men heard about tenements and long hours, but they also heard one simple promise: at least there is a chance. For someone like Thomas, that chance mattered. Remaining in Sicily meant more of the same: hard labor, little pay, dependence on land that could be washed away by one bad season. Leaving meant uncertainty, language barriers, discrimination. Yet the flow of migrants showed which side many young people chose. Passenger lists show that around 1905, he joined this river of humanity heading toward New York. The journey itself was harsh. Third-class passengers slept in crowded conditions in the lower parts of the ship. Seasickness, cramped bunks, and the smell of too many people in a small space made those weeks feel far longer. Men and women shared stories in dialects from different regions, all bound together by a mix of fear and hope. Thomas was one more figure in that crowd, carrying a small bag and large expectations. When the ship finally approached New York Harbor, the sight of the Statue of Liberty was not just a symbol. It was a promise that their struggle might have meaning. Yet there was no magic waiting past that copper figure, only lines, inspections, and relentless questions at Ellis Island. Immigration officers looked into eyes, listened to answers, checked papers. Many newcomers felt like they had already been judged before a word came out of their mouths. Somehow, Thomas made it through. He stepped onto American soil with little money, no English, and a last name that would be mispronounced by most people he met outside his community. Like many from his region, he gravitated to neighborhoods where people spoke Sicilian and Italian, where shop signs carried familiar surnames, and where church bells sounded like those back home. New York's Italian districts were crowded and loud. Pushcarts lined the streets, selling bread, vegetables, and fish. Children darted between adults, chasing one another over cracked pavement. Above this chaos rose tenement buildings, stacked with families layered floor upon floor. Privacy was rare, air was thick, and work rarely paid enough. Yet to the new arrivals, this crowded world felt alive with opportunity, at least compared to the quiet desperation they had left. Thomas found early employment the way many did, through friends of friends, countrymen from Corleone or nearby towns. Historical sources describe him as a truck driver and later as someone connected to the transportation of goods. Trucks and horse-drawn wagons moved flour, olives, and other staples from warehouses to shops. It was hard work, but it placed him in a position that would matter later. He saw where goods moved, who controlled which routes, and who demanded extra payments to keep things running smoothly. At that time, Italian neighborhoods in New York faced constant pressure from extortionists known as Black Hand operators and early organized crime groups like the Morello clan. Many small shop owners and workers paid protection money to avoid harassment, beatings, or damage to their property. Fear traveled quickly down those crowded streets. People spoke quietly about envelopes of cash handed over to shadowy figures, and about what happened if someone refused. Living in this environment, a young man learned that there were two kinds of rules. One came from the city and the police, often distant and delivered in a foreign language. The other came from local power figures who walked the same sidewalks and whose orders could not be ignored. Those who controlled gambling, loan sharking, and extortion in the area did so not just with threats, but with favors, finding jobs, settling disputes, offering loans no bank would give. Their influence grew from knowing both fear and loyalty. Over time, Thomas gravitated toward these circles. It was not a leap taken in a single day. It started with favors, carrying messages, introducing one person to another, making sure goods arrived where they should. Being reliable in small tasks built trust. Familiar names appear in the records of that period. The Morello family, Ignazio Lupo the Wolf Lupo, and other early figures who wove greed and neighborhood politics into an underworld network. Authorities would later identify Gagliano as an associate of the Morello group, and eventually as part of the crew led by Gitano Tom Riene, who controlled operations in the Bronx and parts of Harlem. To understand what that meant, it helps to picture a staircase of involvement. At the bottom, there were lookouts and couriers. A step above stood enforcers and trusted workers. Higher up were men who made decisions, balanced violence against business interests, and handled contact with politicians or corrupt officials. Slowly, Thomas climbed that staircase. What helped him rise was not wild aggression. Instead, those who studied his life describe him as reserved, thoughtful, and patient. While others sought flashier roles, he remembered the lessons of Corleone. Speak little, listen more. Never show everything you think. In communities where tempers often ran hot and pride could lead to reckless choices, his steady approach made him useful. As he deepened his role in Rienne's organization, the nature of his work changed. He was no longer simply moving goods. He was helping control who could do business in certain neighborhoods. Trucking, ice delivery, and the movement of food, seemingly ordinary trades, became tools of power. If a shopkeeper wanted regular deliveries at a fair price, it might depend on whether he cooperated with the local group. If a rival tried to run a new route, problems could suddenly appear. Broken equipment, delayed shipments, frightened drivers. These tactics fell under what law enforcement would later call racketeering. The idea was simple: using threats, implied or direct, to control entire sectors of business, while keeping formal ownership scattered among different names. By staying in the background and using intermediaries, men like Gagliano tried to make it difficult for investigators to trace crimes back to them personally. Even so, the police were not blind to what was happening. Reports from that period mentioned stabbings, shootings, and suspicious fires, all connected loosely to disputes over territory and payments. Many of these incidents were never solved in court. Witnesses withdrew complaints, claimed they saw nothing, or vanished. This pattern reinforced the reputation of silence in those neighborhoods. However, each incident added to a hidden record building in the minds of detectives and future historians. A pattern of crime woven into daily life, with leaders like Rienne and his trusted lieutenants, among them Tommy Gagliano. The years before Prohibition were a kind of training ground. Men involved in the Italian underworld learned how to share profits, how to avoid open wars when possible, and how to use legitimate fronts such as bakeries, coal companies, and trucking firms to mask illegal earnings. Thomas observed, learned, and adapted. He saw which alliances lasted, which personalities clashed, and how quickly fortunes could change when someone made the wrong enemy. In those days, he married and started a family, though details about his private home life have not been widely documented. That, too, fits his character. He guarded not only his criminal operations but also his personal affairs. To neighbors, he appeared as another hard-working immigrant man, perhaps a bit more serious than others, but not dramatically different. If they suspected he had connections, most would have preferred not to know. By the late 1910s, the stage for a much larger transformation was being set. Political groups and reformers pushed for a nationwide ban on alcoholic beverages. Many businessmen dismissed the idea as unrealistic. Yet men like Rienne and those around him, Gagliano included, paid close attention. They understood that if alcohol became illegal, millions of ordinary citizens would still want to drink. Whoever could supply that demand, quietly and efficiently, would gain money and influence beyond anything the old rackets had produced. For someone like Thomas, whose background was in transportation and who had experience coordinating shipments, this change was especially significant. Moving contraband required planning, trusted drivers, hidden storage, and contact with corrupt officials willing to look the other way. All the small lessons of his early years in New York, loyalty, discretion, careful planning, were about to be tested on a far greater scale. On January 17, 1920, national prohibition began. That date would reshape organized crime in America. It marked the moment when figures who had previously struggled for modest control over neighborhoods suddenly found paths to extraordinary wealth. Thomas Gagliano, already positioned within Rienne's organization, now stepped into an era where his decisions would affect not just a few streets in New York, but networks spreading throughout the city and beyond. In the warm, sleepless nights of those first Prohibition years, when speakeasies buzzed behind unmarked doors and trucks rolled through the dark with hidden cargo, his role in the underworld deepened. The quiet man from Corleone, who had once carried small packages and kept his head down, was becoming part of the spine of a rising criminal structure. still cautious, still understated, but now moving closer to the center of power. The first years after alcohol was banned turned nighttime New York into a maze of back rooms and code words. People who had never broken a law in their lives learned how to knock 3 times on an unmarked door, how to speak softly to the right waiter, how to hide a bottle under a coat when walking home. Bars shut their front doors and opened secret ones in basements and upstairs flats. Street corners that used to grow quiet after dark now pulsed with quiet movement as cars slowed. Lights flicked twice, and trucks rolled past with cargo that never appeared on any invoice. For someone like Thomas Gagliano, who already understood trucking routes, storage spaces, and neighborhood habits, this chaos looked less like confusion and more like a giant, unfinished system waiting to be organized. The crew around Gitano Tom, Riene, used its base in the Bronx to carve out an important role. Ice and coal were still essential in those days. Ice kept food cold, coal heated homes, so delivery companies had reason to visit nearly every block. Those same wagons and trucks could, under the right management, carry something extra. Publicly, the Riene group seemed focused on legitimate trades: ice plants, coal yards, and the trucks that linked them to tenement cellars and restaurant basements. Behind that, a second layer grew. Barrels and crates containing liquor moved along the same paths as legal goods, often stacked cleverly so that a casual glance saw nothing unusual. Drivers learned which routes to take, which patrolmen were friendly, and when to switch vehicles to break any simple trail. Thomas, with his quiet manner and patience for details, excelled at this. He knew that mistakes drew attention, and attention led to questions. So he mapped out delivery schedules designed not just for profit but for invisibility. A truck loaded with illegal alcohol might also carry sacks of coal or blocks of ice, heading first to one customer, then another, so that any watcher would see routine commercial work, not a dedicated smuggling line. The more ordinary it looked, the safer it was. Within Riene's circle, another figure began standing frequently at his side, a younger man named Thomas Lukes. Where Gagliano was reserved, Lukes was more outgoing and expressive, quick with a joke and a sharp observation. Both shared roots in the same world of Italian neighborhoods and small rackets, and both appreciated discretion. Over time, they developed a relationship built on trust. Riene relied on them to manage important operations in the Bronx and beyond, while they, in turn, benefited from his protection and contacts. The criminal side of their business expanded beyond liquor. With prohibition creating new money streams, competitors appeared everywhere: other Italian groups, Irish gangs, and independent operators eager for a cut. Arguments over territory and payments sometimes escalated into violence. Historical accounts tie the Riene organization to shootings and assaults connected to control of trucking routes, ice depots, and bootleg distribution. These acts were rarely public spectacles. Usually they happened in alleys on dark streets or in quiet offices, designed to send a message without creating headlines. Even when he helped oversee activities that involved threats and, at times, deadly force, Gagliano kept his usual distance from the front line. He preferred intermediaries, men who carried instructions, negotiated terms, and when it came to it, enforced discipline. That did not absolve him of responsibility. He was part of a structure that maintained power through fear and the knowledge that defiance could have serious consequences. Yet his face rarely appeared in police reports. Street-level officers knew names of enforcers. Detectives whispered about the ones who sat behind them. Thomas belonged firmly to the second group. As profits from alcohol flowed in, the family looked for stable foundations that would last even after prohibition ended. Construction offered exactly that. New York was growing upward and outward. Apartment houses, office towers, and factories needed concrete, steel, lath, and plaster. Work crews needed unions. Unions needed leaders. Leaders, if pressured or paid, could steer contracts, wages, and hearing lists. It was a field rich in opportunity for anyone willing to bend rules and apply pressure. Sources from later investigations link Gagliano to companies in the building trades, especially those linked to lathing and plasterwork. By placing trusted men inside trade unions, he and his associates could influence which contractors received jobs and under what terms. A builder who wanted a project to move smoothly often found it easier to cooperate through inflated bids, side payments, or hearing recommended subcontractors than to risk strikes, delays, or accidents on site. Again, Thomas's style shaped these operations. He encouraged arrangements that kept things calm on the surface. Workers received steady employment, which made them less likely to complain. Contractors got predictable schedules, even if they paid more than they might have in a fully open market. Trouble appeared mostly when someone tried to bypass the system. Then intimidation emerged. Damaged equipment, slowdowns that seemed accidental, visits from unfamiliar men who hinted at problems that might develop. The threat of worse hung in the background, usually unspoken but widely understood. Above this level of neighborhood and trade control loomed a larger struggle. By the late 1920s, Italian organized crime in New York had sorted itself into several major power centers. On one side stood Giuseppe, Joe the Boss Masseria, whose influence stretched across various groups, including Rienese. On the other was a coalition of men from the Castellamare region of Sicily, centered around Salvatore Maranzano. Beneath them, younger leaders like Charles Lucky, Luciano, and his contemporaries navigated between old loyalties and new ambitions. Rienese, whose family held valuable territory in the Bronx and parts of Manhattan, theoretically owed allegiance to Masseria, yet tensions grew. Some accounts suggest Rienese quietly favored Maranzano, believing the Castellamares alliance offered more stability or better terms. In a world where shifting sides could mean life or death, such rumors mattered. Trust eroded quickly when men suspected double dealing. Within Rienese's crew, including people like Gagliano and Lucchese, these larger rivalries filtered down as uneasy conversations and careful glances. They understood that selecting the wrong patron at the wrong moment could cost not only rackets, but lives. Their primary concern was keeping their organization intact, their income steady, and their people as safe as a criminal enterprise could manage. Navigating between Masseria and Maranzano required subtlety. In February 1930, subtlety vanished in a burst of gunfire. Gaetano Rienese, leaving his home in the Bronx one cold evening, was shot near his car. There were no dramatic speeches, no warnings shouted in the street, only the swift, final end that so often marked underworld disputes. Law enforcement later tied the killing to orders from Masseria, carried out by Vito Genovese or another trusted shooter, as punishment for Rienese's suspected drift toward Maranzano's camp. For Thomas, this was more than the loss of a boss. Rienese had been mentor, shield, and gateway to influence. His death sent a shock through the Bronx organization. Drivers, collectors, union stewards, and enforcers all felt exposed. The man who had balanced relations with other families, the one whose name carried weight in negotiations, was suddenly gone. In that vacuum, everyone watched to see who would rise and which outside power would try to claim the spoils. Masseria moved quickly. Determined to keep the profitable Rienese family under his control, he installed Joseph Pinzolo as the new head. Pinzolo had experience in rackets and a reputation as a loyal Masseria supporter, but he lacked deep ties to the Bronx crews he was supposed to command. To many of Rienese's longtime associates, including Gagliano and Lucchese, he looked like an intruder dropped into the middle of their carefully built system. Frustration grew. Pinzolo was believed to be eyeing the most lucrative rackets, especially the ice and coal interests, and parts of the construction-related schemes, for himself and his own circle. Men who had taken risks for years under Rienese felt passed over, their contributions ignored. Rumors circulated that Pinzolo spoke dismissively of the old guard, treating them as subordinates rather than partners. In a culture where respect meant survival, such attitudes bred resentment. At the same time, the broader conflict between Masseria and Maranzano intensified. Shootings and disappearances on both sides marked what would later be known as the Castellammare War. Though much of the open violence took place in Brooklyn and Manhattan, its shadows fell across every Italian-run crew in the city. People counted who visited whom, who failed to show up at funerals, who suddenly changed their routines. Any sign of disloyalty could be interpreted as a move toward the enemy. In this tense climate, Pinzolo's presence became even more precarious. The older Bronx hands were said to be quietly aligning themselves with Maranzano's faction, calculating that his victory might restore their independence and allow one of their own to take command. According to later testimonies, including that of mob turncoat Joseph Valachi, both Thomas Gagliano and Thomas Lucchese reached understandings with Maranzano's side, promising support at the right moment. In early September 1930, the simmering dispute with Pinzolo ended abruptly. He was found shot in a Manhattan office used by a legitimate business associate. Once again, there were no witnesses willing to speak. The killing bore the marks of an inside job. The victim had clearly felt safe enough to enter and sit down. Police immediately suspected men from the Bronx, and Lucchese in particular was questioned. Yet no one would testify, and evidence proved too thin for a conviction. While official records never named Gagliano as a charged suspect, informed observers have long believed that he and Lucchese at least approved the move, if they did not plan it directly. Removing Pinzolo cleared the path for Bronx-based leadership to reassert control over their organization. It also signaled to both Masseria and Maranzano that the Riene family's old guard would not meekly accept outside domination. They demanded a say in their own future. The Castellammare War raged on into 1931, with casualties on both sides. Masseria's faction suffered repeated blows as Maranzano's supporters, backed by alliances and careful planning, ate into his base. Somewhere in this swirl, Gagliano and his closest associates worked to preserve their rackets while keeping their true loyalties as opaque as possible. Outwardly, they still had to function within a system where Masseria claimed authority. Privately, they leaned toward the side they believed would ultimately prevail. That turning point came when Lucky Luciano and his circle arranged for the elimination of both old rivals, first Masseria and then, months later, Maranzano himself. The double removal ended the war and opened the way for a new structure. Instead of one man standing above all others, a board-like arrangement emerged, known later as the Commission. It allowed the most powerful family heads to settle disputes collectively and set broad rules for cooperation. When the dust settled, New York's underworld had been reorganized into 5 main families, each with distinct territories and rackets. Among them stood the group rooted in Riene's old Bronx base, now under new, stable leadership. Multiple sources agree that in this rebalanced world, Thomas Gagliano was recognized as the head of that family. Years of quiet work, careful positioning, and survival through 2 assassinated bosses had brought him to the top at last. He did not celebrate with fanfare. There were no parades, no public displays of wealth. Instead, he retreated into the style he knew best: low visibility, modest appearance, steady control. At his side stood Thomas Lucchese, serving as underboss, advisor, and bridge to younger associates. Together, they now commanded a network that touched liquor, unions, construction, gambling, and more. A criminal empire hidden behind storefronts, offices, and membership halls. The boy from Corleone, who had once watched powerful men from a distance, was now one of them, though he still preferred to let others take more of the spotlight and the accompanying risk. By the early 1930s, the streets where Thomas once hauled coal and ice now belonged, in a quiet way, to him. Not in the legal sense. No title deeds bore his name. No company signs advertised Gagliano and Sons. His control lived in conversations, loyalties, and the understanding that if you worked certain trades in the Bronx or parts of Manhattan, you eventually dealt with his people. The new order that followed the bloody power struggle tried to avoid another disaster. Instead of one aging boss of bosses, the leading families formed a kind of council. Each major group had a seat, and disputes were supposed to be settled by votes and negotiation. While other chiefs enjoyed being seen as statesmen of the underworld, Gagliano stayed close to what he knew: trucks, jobs, contracts, and the day-to-day flow of money. Among the men gathered around that informal table, he was the least flashy. Lucky Luciano, despite his own taste for caution, moved comfortably among politicians, gamblers, and nightclub owners. Others carried reputations for outbursts, for showy meetings in expensive restaurants, for dramatic speeches about honor and tradition. Thomas, by contrast, showed up, listened, said little, and went home. That habit, which might have held him back in another world, made him invaluable in this one. When a man never raised his voice and rarely demanded the spotlight, he seemed less threatening, and that made cooperation easier. Inside his own group, though, there was nothing uncertain about his authority. The old Riene family now answered to him. At his right hand stood Thomas Lukes, quick and adaptable, the one many outsiders dealt with directly. If someone from another family wanted to coordinate a shared operation, a gambling spot, a transport line, a union contract, they were just as likely to sit down with Lukes as with Gagliano. Yet everyone understood that major decisions still came from the older man, who weighed risks carefully and preferred long-term stability to short-term grabs. Prohibition had not ended the public's thirst overnight. Even after the law changed in 1933 and legal drinking returned, underground liquor lines continued for a time, serving unlicensed bars, tax dodgers, and customers who liked the old hidden ways. But anyone who built their entire future on bootlegging could read the signs. That wave was receding. Those who had planned ahead, shifting profits into other fields, would last. Those who had not would drift back into small-time rackets or fall behind. For Gagliano, alcohol had been just one branch of a larger network. Long before repeal, he and his circle had sunk roots into industries that would always exist as long as cities grew: construction, transport, food distribution. Entertainment. He understood something simple and powerful. Whoever controlled how things moved, concrete, textiles, produce, even people, held quiet leverage far beyond their immediate neighborhood. In the building trades, his influence grew steadily. Companies involved in putting up walls and ceilings, installing lath and plaster, laying brick, and hauling materials became part of his orbit. Some he touched from a distance, through friendly union officials who steered work and settled disputes. Others had owners who were active associates, blending legitimate business with under-the-table arrangements. The pattern repeated itself. A contractor approaching a big project might find a suggestion placed before him, hire certain subcontractors, sign agreements with specific labor locals, and in return face no slowdowns, no mysterious equipment failures, no surprise inspections triggered by anonymous tips. Costs went up, of course, because kickbacks and padded invoices had to be paid, but the buildings rose on schedule, and in a town where delays could bleed investors dry, predictability became its own kind of bargain. Workers sometimes gained small advantages under this system: steady shifts, wage bumps, or the sense that someone powerful stood behind their local if management pushed too hard. Yet there was a cost they did not always see. When leadership answered quietly to men like Gagliano, ordinary union members had little real say. Any voice that made too much noise about corruption or internal elections could find itself shut out of jobs, threatened, or, in the worst cases, harmed. Violence was rarely showy. It might look like a bar fight, a street mugging, or a chance encounter gone wrong. People in those circles learned to guess what lay behind such accidents and to adjust their behavior accordingly. The garment district in Manhattan became another pillar of his world. That crowded area west of Broadway, where sewing machines whirred from morning to night, depended on fleets of trucks and vans to carry cloth and finished clothing between warehouses, factories, and stores. Control those trucks, and you touched almost every manufacturer's pulse. Under Gagliano's guidance, associates moved into trucking firms and related unions that serviced the clothing trade. Again, The method followed a familiar script. A few cooperative leaders were supported, rivals found themselves pushed aside, and before long a quiet monopoly formed. A factory owner who wanted his shipments picked up on time understood that hearing certain carriers was no longer optional. Refuse, and trucks might forget your address, or your deliveries might arrive damaged if at all. In some cases, illegal gambling dens and loan sharking operations sprouted near these industrial zones, turning workers' wages into another source of income. Men burning through paychecks at card tables or dice games often found themselves short on rent or family needs. Loans appeared, offered by friendly faces but backed by harsh terms. Late payments led to pressure, and pressure gave the lenders more leverage, not just over individuals, but over entire shops where workers now feared losing both income and safety. Through all this, law enforcement tried to keep up. Investigators saw the patterns: contractors paying above-market rates to the same set of firms, union elections that always ended with pre-selected names, freight companies that never seemed to face strikes while their rivals suffered constant trouble. But proving that these patterns sprang from criminal direction, rather than coincidence or rough business practice, was difficult. Records were scattered, witnesses reluctant. The man suspected of pulling many strings lived modestly, avoided luxury cars, and seldom appeared in places where photographers might be lurking. Gagliano's strength lay in that very invisibility. Other bosses built reputations that drew admiration or fear far beyond their actual reach. He let those figures attract attention, including the attention of prosecutors and newspapers, while he concentrated on running a relatively calm, profitable organization. Violence within his family's ranks did occur. This world did not function without it. But compared to the fireworks around some of his counterparts, his domain looked almost quiet. That quiet did not mean harmless. Every controlled union cut into actual competition. Every rigged bid raised construction costs that eventually flowed into rents and prices. Every frightened witness who stayed silent helped keep a system alive where ordinary people had fewer choices. The harm spread out in small increments, hard to see in any single moment, but heavy when added together over years. In the mid-1930s, when Luciano was arrested and finally convicted on vice charges, the upper structure of organized crime shifted again. Officially, he remained a symbolic figurehead for a time, even from prison. Informally, others filled the space he left behind. Frank Costello took on much of the political and business-facing side of matters. Vito Genovese, when present in New York, shaped more aggressive moves. The heads of the other families watched carefully, balancing their own interests. Through this turbulence, Gagliano kept his group steady. He maintained good working relationships with the other leaders, avoiding open conflict. When the commission met to iron out disputes about territory, about how to respond to some new challenge, his voice argued consistently for arrangements that reduced risk and preserved revenue. He had lived through a war that nearly tore their world apart. He had no interest in starting another. At home, his personal life remained largely shielded from view. He lived for years in East Harlem and later in New Jersey, in houses that looked like anyone else. Neighbors remembered a polite, somewhat distant man, often described as a businessman with clothing interests or building connections. He was not the kind of neighbor who threw loud parties or boasted about money. If he had visitors, they arrived quietly, stayed for coffee or a meal, and left. To children on the block, he was just another older immigrant on the stoop, watching the street. Inside his family, succession planning slowly took shape. Age and health do not spare men simply because they hold secret authority. As the 1930s slipped into the 1940s, the older boss watched younger associates grow into their roles. Lukis, especially, handled more and more daily affairs. When someone needed to smooth over a dispute between captains, he did it. When a new racket appeared and needed evaluation, numbers games in a fresh neighborhood, a new angle in the produce markets, a promising contact in a union office, he often took the first meeting. Still, when issues touched the long-established rackets in the Bronx, the garment district, or the building trades that formed the skeleton of the family's power, nothing major changed without Thomas's approval. He had built those structures over decades, brick by unseen brick. He trusted his judgment, and so did those who had watched him survive while louder men fell. World events cast shadows even on this closed world. The Great Depression had already carved hunger and desperation into the city. Then came war in Europe, and after Pearl Harbor, war for the United States as well. Military service pulled some younger associates away, while wartime production reshaped industries. Factories retooled, shipyards boomed, and government contracts multiplied. Wherever government money flowed, men like Gagliano saw opportunities and dangers. Increased federal attention made open theft of war-related funds risky, but there were still subtler angles. Certain materials became rationed, and those who could divert supplies quietly for private use or sale profited. Shipping routes shifted, and new labor disputes emerged in docks and warehouses. Some of these flashpoints touched his sphere, others he chose to avoid. Calculating that sticking to well-established niches brought less risk than chasing every new opening. Even as the world seemed to burn, his daily routine stayed surprisingly regular. Mornings often began with simple habits: newspapers, a walk, calls made from payphones rather than his home line. He preferred meetings in cafes, barber shops, or modest offices, never in places where an ambitious detective might hope to stage a raid with reporters in tow. Constant changes in venue made it harder to establish patterns that investigators could track. Federal and local authorities never fully ignored him. His name appeared in confidential reports and informant statements, often alongside vague descriptions. Quiet, older man, controls important rackets, difficult to penetrate. Periodic hearings on organized crime mentioned his group among those suspected of labor racketeering, gambling, and illicit control of trucking and construction. But he avoided the spotlight that had doomed others. There were no dramatic trials with his name splashed across front pages. No photos of him led in handcuffs through crowds of shouting journalists. Part of that success came from discipline. He discouraged drug dealing within his sphere, understanding that narcotics drew intense law enforcement attention and caused chaos even among his own people. Gambling, loans, labor, and business skimming already provided more than enough income. By steering away from some of the most explosive rackets, he reduced both profits and risk, but he valued survival over maximum gain. By the early 1940s, men in the underworld spoke of him with a kind of muted respect. Younger figures who craved fast wealth sometimes dismissed his cautious style as old-fashioned. Yet they could not ignore that he had led his family through 2 tumultuous decades without catastrophic wars or spectacular collapses. Families that fought too often lost leaders, soldiers, and money. His group, by contrast, was solid, quieter than most, but firmly anchored in crucial sectors of the city's economy. At home, his age began to show. He moved more slowly, delegated more. Visitors noticed a man still sharp in conversation, still careful with words but less interested in daily frictions and more focused on the broad lines of succession and stability. He knew that no matter how cautiously he lived, one simple biological limit remained. He would not be there forever. The system he and others had built would outlast them, for better or worse. Around him, the city changed again as the war ended and the late 1940s brought returning soldiers, housing shortages, and another surge of construction. Glass towers and sprawling suburbs both demanded the same things he had always understood: concrete, steel, transport, and behind the scenes, agreements that determined who got which piece of the work. As contracts for new apartment complexes and office buildings were signed, as garment production adjusted to peacetime demand, as trucking firms multiplied around new highways, many of them still passed, often unknowingly, through channels that traced back to that quiet man from Corleone who had learned, long ago, the value of staying in the background while shaping the scene. His story, though nearing its final chapters, still had a few turns left. The world he helped run was too large, too entrenched, to remain untouched by the next wave of scrutiny and the slow, persistent pressure of law enforcement and public exposure. The war ended with whistles and crowds in Times Square, but for the men who ran things in the shadows, the change felt slower and heavier. Years of ration books and factory overtime gave way to different kind of pressure: returning soldiers, rising expectations, and a wave of new money flowing into roads, houses, and factories. New York spread outward, and wherever the city stretched concrete and steel, the reach of the old Bronx organization stretched with it. By then, Thomas was no longer a young man slipping in and out of tenements. He was in his 60s, careful with his steps, slower to climb stairs, but still sharp when the subject turned to trucks, contracts, and the balance between pushing hard and attracting trouble. In a world where many bosses craved recognition within their own circles, he still preferred to be the name spoken last and quietly, as if saying it too loudly might summon unwanted attention. He spent more time outside Manhattan, in modest New Jersey neighborhoods where lawns and trees softened the noise of the city. To outsiders, he looked like a retired businessman who had done well enough to move across the river. The houses around him held sales clerks, mechanics, office workers. Kids played stickball in the street, glancing now and then at the older man walking past with steady steps, never guessing how many nervous shop owners and contractors shaped their decisions around his unspoken rules. Inside the organization, however, his presence remained unmistakable. The core rackets under his guidance had settled into a pattern. In the garment district, trucking remained tightly managed. Companies that hauled cloth and finished outfits to warehouses and stores knew whose calls they had to return first. Drivers who wanted steady work learned which dispatcher's word mattered most. Problems, late shipments, lost crates, damaged goods often disappeared when an owner made the right payments or hired the right firm, whose real loyalty lay not with the customer but with men like Thomas. In the building trades, his people continued to influence who held the tools and who held the contracts. Lathing, plastering, and related crafts, so unglamorous that few outside the industry ever thought about them, became one of his strongest foundations. By guiding union leaders, he shaped bid lists and job rosters. When a big construction project was announced, a new apartment block in the Bronx, a warehouse in Queens, a factory in New Jersey, someone from his circle usually appeared early, quietly asking questions about materials, schedules, and the companies being considered. Sometimes the pressure was subtle, a friendly warning that hiring the wrong subcontractor might cause delays. Sometimes it was more direct, a union delegate explaining that members simply would not show up if certain conditions weren't met. Most builders, already juggling bank loans, deadlines, and building inspectors, chose not to fight battles they could not see clearly. They signed the agreements, added an extra margin to their budgets, and told themselves this was just how things worked in New York. Gambling and loans remained part of the picture as well. In back rooms, small games of chance continued to spin off debts and favors. A losing streak might bring a player to a man offering quick cash at steep terms. Pay on time, and he stayed on the pleasant side of the arrangement. Fall behind, and new visitors appeared, reminding him of obligations with tones that left little doubt about consequences. The details varied, sometimes a frightened restaurant owner, sometimes a shop clerk, sometimes a union member already struggling, but the pattern didn't. None of this required Thomas to raise his voice or appear in person at heated moments. He ran his world through layers: captains who managed zones, lieutenants who handled crews, collectors who walked into stores and offices, and enforcers who were called only if words failed. He heard about problems during quiet sit-downs in diners, in the back sections of social clubs, or during walks on side streets where passing traffic masked conversation. When a man like that said, "Let's keep things calm," everyone grasped what that meant. Fix this before it becomes something uglier. Law enforcement efforts grew more organized during those years. Local detectives still handled day-to-day cases, but federal agencies were paying more attention to long-term patterns, labor racketeering, interstate trucking schemes, coordinated gambling operations. Names like Luciano and Costello drew headlines. Their stories fit newspaper needs for dramatic tales of fallen underworld kings. Beside those headlines, the name Gagliano rarely appeared in large print, but it did show up in internal memos and confidential files. Investigators knew of a quiet boss linked to the old Rene group, now overseeing a family-level organization rooted in the Bronx and deeply involved in unions and commerce. They suspected his involvement in extortion, bid rigging, concealed partnerships, and the kind of intimidation that never left fingerprints. Yet getting witnesses to talk about him was almost impossible. Shop owners might whisper to a trusted detective, then fall silent when asked to sign a statement. Union officials mumbled about politics and internal disputes, never naming the men who truly set the course. Part of his protection lay in how he lived. He didn't stroll into high-end nightclubs known for police raids. He didn't pose for photos with entertainers or politicians. He favored low-key restaurants in neighborhoods where people minded their own business. When he needed to travel, he sometimes used public transport or inconspicuous cars. No big new sedans with white wall tires and fancy chrome that screamed for attention. To any watching officer, he looked like one more aging immigrant out for a meal. Within his circle, stories circulated about his temperament. He was firm, but he rarely exploded. When subordinates argued in front of him, he listened, weighed each side, and then delivered a decision in a level voice that made further debate pointless. The men under him knew he would tolerate disagreements spoken respectfully, but disobedience after a decision came down was another matter entirely. Those who tried to play both sides in an internal dispute sometimes found themselves quietly removed, their income streams reassigned, their names no longer mentioned at meetings. He valued men who thought ahead. Associates who brought him only half-formed schemes promising fast cash without considering risks found themselves sidelined. Ideas that used existing unions, businesses, and contacts more efficiently were more welcome. For example, in some neighborhoods his people encouraged the spread of numbers games, informal lotteries popular in working-class communities, but tied them to existing barbershops, candy stores, and newsstands. That way, bets slipped into everyday life, wrapped in the appearance of routine commerce. The shop owners took a modest cut, the runners handled collections, and only a few trusted figures knew where the money really ended up. Throughout the 1940s, the broader landscape of organized crime continued to shift. Some families saw violent internal upheavals. Others lost leaders to prison or sudden deaths. The commission structure tried to limit reckless behavior, but it could not remove all rivalry. Disagreements over revenue, disrespect between ambitious underlings, and the constant appearance of new opportunities meant tensions never truly disappeared. In those larger meetings where family heads or their top deputies gathered, Thomas kept pursuing the same line: avoid unnecessary wars, share certain ventures when conflict would cost more than cooperation, and keep violence as controlled as possible. He had seen what open conflict in the past had done, how it drew in law enforcement, sparked public panic, and disrupted business for everyone. In his view, the point of power was security and income, not constant chaos. Still, not every edge could be smoothed. Now and then, men in his own ranks clashed with neighboring groups over a promising bookmaker, a planned card room, or influence in a particular local union. Most of these spats were resolved through quiet talks, trade-offs, and small payments. On rarer occasions, they escalated. When someone disappeared or was found dead under suspicious circumstances, newspapers might label it a gangland slaying and link it loosely to unnamed underworld figures. Officially, no one knew anything. Unofficially, word traveled in hushed tones about who had overstepped and who had answered. Age changed his view of these episodes. Where he might once have been more willing to approve force to assert control, he now leaned harder on persuasion, threats of financial penalties, demotions, and exile to less profitable corners of the organization. A man sent from a lucrative Bronx route to handle a small operation in a distant borough understood the message. Fall in line, or this slide will continue. Only in cases where someone truly endangered the family's stability, or betrayed secrets to rivals or authorities, did the final, irreversible penalties become likely. Outside this circle, the American public slowly became more aware that criminal control over unions and businesses was not just a story out of detective novels. Corruption in some labor organizations, fixed contracts, and rigged bids affected prices, wages, and competition in ways that touched ordinary citizens. Reporters, reformers, and a handful of determined prosecutors began to connect dots. Their efforts would eventually build toward national hearings, but during Thomas's lifetime, those storms were only beginning to gather. By the late 1940s, the strain of years started to show clearly. He had spent decades in a life that demanded constant alertness, watching for police, for rivals, for disloyalty inside his own house. That kind of tension wears on the body even when a man avoids open street battles. He complained more often of fatigue. Meetings that once stretched long into the night now ended earlier, with instructions passed to lookies to carry out follow-up work. Bit by bit, he let go of daily management. Captains came to him with summaries rather than details. He wanted to know if income flows were steady, if unions remained under control, if any serious conflicts loomed with other families. The how of it, the particular threats, the precise sums involved, the personalities of newly promoted soldiers, he left more and more to his trusted deputy. The organization that for so long had rested directly under his hands now functioned more like a machine with its own internal gears, still powered by his authority, but increasingly maintained by others. Even as he receded from the everyday scramble, he had moments of reflection. Men close to him later described, in general terms, a boss who spoke occasionally about the old days, the cramped streets of East Harlem, the early coal and ice businesses under Rene, the terrors of the Castellammers War. He never framed these as regrets in public. It was not in his nature or his world to confess that kind of doubt out loud. But he sometimes hinted that the world they had built was far larger and more complicated than the one they had inherited, and not necessarily in a good way. What began as protection rackets and small-time extortion in immigrant neighborhoods had grown into a layered structure reaching into corporations, international shipping, and sprawling post-war housing projects. The sums involved dwarfed those of his youth, but so did the potential consequences. Bigger businesses meant bigger investigations. Cooperation with corrupt officials linked them to scandals that could not be contained to a single block or borough. Every gain seemed to carry a heavier shadow. Around 1950, national attention on organized crime sharpened. Senators launched inquiries, prosecutors compiled thick files, and secret hearings gathered testimony from frightened witnesses. Committees wanted to know how much control criminal groups exerted over unions, over interstate commerce, over politics itself. In that climate, even a careful, low-profile figure could feel pressure building. His name did surface in some investigative materials, usually as a suspected leader of one of the New York families. Yet by that point, he was an aging man whose active role was shrinking. Authorities looking for dramatic showdowns tended to target bosses still visibly in the mix or men whose flamboyant lifestyles matched the public's image of gangsters. A careful, weary figure who lived quietly in New Jersey and rarely stepped into the spotlight did not fit that image, even if his influence remained significant behind the curtain. Sometime in those final months, his health declined more sharply. Accounts differ on the exact timeline, but by early 1951, he was no longer able to maintain even his reduced schedule. Meetings were rarer. Visitors left with instructions not so much on specific rackets as on continuity, keep peace with the other families, respect long-standing arrangements, and ensure that the income streams he had built did not collapse into open fighting once he was gone. In February 1951, Thomas "Tommy" Gagliano died, reportedly of natural causes. There were no gunshots in the street, no police sirens, no dramatic chase. His passing looked, from the outside, like that of any elderly immigrant who had worked hard, kept to himself, and reached the end of a long life. An obituary in a neighborhood paper might have mentioned him simply as a businessman, perhaps nomming a trade like clothing or construction without digging deeper. Inside his world, the reaction was more complicated. The man who had guided the old Riene family through war, reorganization, and decades of quiet expansion was gone. His funeral, by design, did not draw public spectacle. Family, a few neighbors, and selected associates attended. Those who knew his true role kept their faces composed, their words vague. Respect was offered in small gestures, a longer handshake, a lowered voice, a brief remark about steadiness and survival. Leadership passed smoothly to the man everyone had expected for years, Thomas Lukes. On paper, some sources suggest that transition may have begun even before the older boss's death, with Lukes acting informally as head while still acknowledging his mentor. In practice, nothing much changed overnight. The unions were still in place, the trucking firms still running, the gambling and loan networks still operating behind storefronts and social clubs, yet something important had shifted. The cautious Sicilian who had built this structure step by step was no longer there to remind his successors of the cost of open conflict, or to dampen the wilder ideas of younger men hungry for faster riches. His departure left them with his legacy, a strong, diversified criminal organization, deeply entangled with the legitimate economy, and a reputation for quiet efficiency. What they would do with that inheritance, how they would expand it, how they would attract new kinds of scrutiny, would eventually reveal just how far his influence reached beyond his own lifetime. In the years after he was buried, his name did not vanish. It moved into a different kind of conversation, spoken in offices with steel file cabinets and buzzing fluorescent lights, where detectives and federal agents tried to understand how their city had come to be shaped by men most citizens never saw. On the shelves of those offices, cardboard boxes held reports from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, arrest sheets with smudged ink, surveillance notes written in hurried shorthand, typed summaries of informant talks. In many of those papers, there were references that, on their own, did not seem dramatic. Subject believed connected to Bronx ice and coal interests. Reports of influence in Lathing Union, linked to Riene crowd. Only over time did those scattered remarks arrange themselves into a fuller picture of Tommy Gagliano. By the time national attention swung hard toward organized crime around 1950, he was already an old man feeling his strength drain away. Committees in Washington wanted names, faces, and vivid stories that could hold the public's attention. Senators spoke about a national crime syndicate. Investigators drew charts with circles and arrows, trying to show how local gangs connected to something larger. On some of those early diagrams, the Bronx family that he had led was marked with his surname, alongside the other New York groups. He was never hauled before television cameras to be questioned under bright lights. He died before those hearings hit their height, but his absence didn't erase him. It made him a piece of history rather than a live witness. When officials talked about a network of families with roots stretching back before the 1930s, his organization, once known simply as the Riene outfit, then as the Gagliano family, stood as one of the pillars. The man who followed him, Thomas Lukes, had absorbed his habits. Under the new boss, the group continued to specialize in exactly the fields that had made it strong under the old one. Unions in the garment and building trades, trucking, and quiet gambling and loan operations threaded through working neighborhoods. Where Lukes added a slightly more open, social style, the overall culture still reflected the mentor who had come before him. Violence was used carefully. Business interests took priority over showmanship, and long-standing arrangements were honored. From the outside, though, the world around them was changing. The post-war boom brought new highways, suburban developments, and shopping districts. Each new road and building project meant contracts, deliveries, and jobs. The systems Thomas had helped build slipped naturally into this fresh landscape. Trucking companies under friendly control picked up work along new routes. Union locals in growing suburbs recognized the same quiet pressure that had long shaped city projects. The reach of what he'd started no longer stopped at the Bronx River or the Hudson. His name came up again in 1957 after a now famous incident in upstate New York. A powerful figure from another family organized a large gathering at a house in the small town of Appalachian. The idea was to bring bosses and senior men from across the country together in one spot to discuss business and settle questions. Instead, state troopers, suspicious of the expensive cars crowding a quiet rural road, broke up the meeting. Dozens of guests, some in well-cut suits, others running through fields, were stopped and identified. Their names went into reports that quickly reached newspapers. For the first time, the American public saw in plain numbers how many influential figures in different regions recognized something like a common membership. Although Thomas himself had died 6 years earlier, many of the men captured on that day owed their positions to systems he had helped design. Among those detained were key members of the family he had once led, now firmly known by Lucas's name. For agents and journalists, the Appalachian raid forced a deeper look backward. If there really was a kind of national council, as some suspected, when had it begun? Who had shaped its rules? Research pointed them back to the tumultuous early 1930s, to the end of the Castlehammer struggle, and the creation of a cooperative structure among the major New York families. That meant revisiting the quiet, older names. Men like Gagliano, who had sat at the original table and then receded from view. As the 1960s approached, another major crack opened in the wall of silence. A soldier from a different New York family, Joseph Valachi, decided to cooperate with the government. Facing his own legal troubles and fearing for his life, he chose to describe the American mafia in public hearings, naming its rituals, ranks, and important figures. When Valachi spoke under oath about the years before and just after the Castlehammer's conflict, he named the heads of the 5 New York families from that period. Among them, he described Tommy Gagliano, portraying him as a calm, reserved leader with deep connections in the Bronx, the garment district, and the building trades. To viewers around the country, this was likely the first time they had heard the name. To investigators, it was confirmation from the inside that the man they had long suspected of leading one of the main families had indeed held that role. Valachi did not dwell on long, personal stories about him. By the time Valachi was active, Lucas already functioned as the clear boss, but he credited the earlier generations with creating the structure that persisted. From these testimonies, and from other informants over time, a consistent picture emerged. While more dramatic personalities chased power through open shows of force, the quiet boss from Corleone chose measured steps, building an empire that rested on labor racketeering, gambling, and loan schemes rather than constant turf wars. In the decades after his death, prosecutors brought cases that, in their charging papers, reached back to arrangements set during his era. Indictments against union leaders and underworld figures in the 1960s and 70s described long-running conspiracies in the garment and construction industries. Trucking firms were accused of fixing prices and boycotting customers who refused to cooperate. Pension funds and benefit plans for workers were allegedly used as private banks for corrupt officials and their criminal partners. When investigators tried to explain how such deep control became possible, they traced the line back through Lucas to his predecessor, and further back still, to the time when Riene and then Gagliano first combined legitimate companies, union influence, and threats into one coordinated system. The exact choices he made in private rooms could no longer be reconstructed in detail, but the patterns they produced remained visible in testimony, bank records, and business histories. One of the striking parts of his story is how little direct documentation exists about many of his specific actions. Unlike some later figures who left behind transcripts of wiretapped conversations, flashy purchases, and public photos, he operated in an age when surveillance was cruder, and he was personally careful. Historians and crime researchers have had to assemble his biography from passenger lists, census records, scattered arrest notations, newspaper clippings, and the memories of those who dealt with him. Even his birth year varies slightly in available records, a reminder of how loosely such details were kept in Sicilian towns in the late 19th century, and how often paperwork was imprecise at Ellis Island. The broad outline is clear. A boy from Corleone, born in the early 1880s, arrives in New York before the First World War, works at modest jobs, joins Rene's circle, rises during Prohibition, guides a powerful family through the reorganization of the early 1930s, and dies quietly in 1951. Within that outline, the fine-grained scenes of daily criminal decisions: who was threatened, who was beaten, who was muscled out of a contract, can rarely be tied to his direct hand with certainty, even when the larger structure makes his responsibility likely. What is beyond question is the type of crime that grew under his guidance. Extortion didn't always look like a man in a dark alley demanding an envelope at gunpoint. More often, it appeared as a business necessity, a fee paid to a union official to keep peace on a job, a slightly inflated invoice from a preferred trucking company, a loan offered to a struggling shop owner at terms that effectively made refusal impossible. This kind of pressure was quieter but no less real. A contractor who knew that defiance could lead to sabotage or strikes paid not only to avoid trouble, but also because too many others had already yielded, making resistance a lonely stand. For the workers inside those unions, the picture was mixed. Some enjoyed genuine benefits from collective bargaining. Wages and conditions in certain trades did improve compared to the brutal days when labor had little voice. But where criminal groups held real power, union democracy shrank. Insiders picked leaders, elections were staged, and members who tried to protest found themselves frozen out of jobs. The pension funds they counted on for old age became tempting targets for misuse. In later court cases, sums once meant for retirees were shown to have funded speculative ventures, favored companies, or simply vanished into private pockets. Many of the shop owners and small businessmen touched by the systems he helped build never knew his name. They dealt with local collectors, union officers, or business agents who hinted at larger backing. Yet every time they handed over a payment because they feared the alternative, they were responding to a climate created by men at the top, including him. This is one of the subtle truths of his life. The damage he caused was broad but rarely theatrical, expressed in raised rents, padded prices, and decades of distorted competition. As crime writers and scholars in later years sifted through the history of organized crime in New York, they often paused on his example when discussing leadership styles. Compared to some of his successors in other families, he seemed almost modest. He did not chase control of every possible racket. He stayed away, as far as records show, from large-scale narcotics dealing at a time when that trade was beginning to tempt younger men with huge profits. Whether this was a moral line for him, or simply another form of caution, is hard to say. What matters is that he recognized drugs as a guaranteed way to attract intense scrutiny and instability. That choice did not make his world benign. Instead, it made it more sustainable. Racketeering in labor and business could continue for decades if handled carefully. Bribes to pliant officials smoothed the way. Intimidation stayed just below the level that would stir public panic. Cracks only started to widen when ambitious figures departed from that model, choosing riskier, louder paths that drew investigators with greater urgency. From this angle, Part of his legacy is the demonstration that crime can hide most effectively not in dramatic incidents, but inside ordinary routines. A truck making its daily rounds, a union rep attending a negotiation, an accountant filling out numbers on a contract. None of these images evoke danger on their own. Yet when guided quietly by someone like him, they can form a machine that channels vast sums away from open competition and toward a handful of hands. In the neighborhoods where he had once walked, much changed after his death. Old tenements came down, highways cut through established blocks, and new housing projects rose. Children of immigrants moved to suburbs, chasing different dreams. Many of the people who had known him by sight aged and passed away. By the time the 1970s and 80s rolled around, his face would have been unknown even among many of the younger men still earning from the rackets he had helped shape. Yet his name remained in organizational charts drawn in courtrooms and textbooks. When people referred to the Lucchese family, crime historians often reminded readers that, for 2 decades, it had been the Gagliano family. That earlier name carried with it an entire period of development. The formative years when the pattern of using labor and trucking as the backbone of an underworld empire took hold. In that sense, his story does not end fully with his burial. It continues in the way later generations, both criminals and those who fought them, viewed the possibilities and limits of quiet power. Some learned from his methods, copying his refusal to court unnecessary attention. Others pointed to his example as evidence that leaving men like him undisturbed for too long allowed them to grow roots that were extraordinarily hard to pull up. The boy from Corleone, who arrived in America with almost nothing, reached a level of hidden influence that shaped parts of New York's economy for half a century. He did it without spectacular shootouts or open public defiance. Instead, he moved gradually, using relationships, threats, and money to bend unions and businesses toward his purposes. The price of that success was paid not just by rivals and wayward associates, but by countless ordinary workers and business owners who never had the freedom to deal in a truly open market. Those are the traces he left behind: altered prices on building ledgers, skewed bargaining tables, nervous glances in boardrooms and back rooms when the question of who really controls this came up. Long after he was gone, those traces still needed to be untangled, a task that would occupy investigators, reformers, and courts for many years, as they tried to unwind not only his personal history, but also the larger system he had done so much to build. Years went by, and the man himself was no longer around to give orders or to correct anyone's version of his past. Yet, in ways he never saw, the shape of his life kept turning up in rooms where people studied folded documents and grainy photographs, trying to understand how a single city could carry so much unseen pressure. In the early 1950s, when he died, the United States was just starting to admit openly that there was something more organized than random local gangs at work. The Kefauver hearings brought senators to cities across the country, looking for signs of a national criminal network. Television carried images of witnesses refusing to answer questions, or dodging with half-truths. Most viewers had never heard of prohibition bosses like Riene or the steady successor who took his place. But in private, staff consultants quietly added his name to internal lists. Early leader in the Bronx, important in labor rackets, associated with the emerging five-family structure. The committees finished their reports, public interest cooled, and life continued. Yet through the 1950s and into the 1960s, other investigators picked up where they had left off. In New York, young prosecutors studying union corruption in the garment and construction industries kept encountering arrangements that clearly predated the men currently in charge. Wiretaps and informants described old understandings nobody wanted to disturb, agreements from back when the first big bosses set things up. Those first arrangements reached back to his era, when a contractor in 1962 complained quietly to an investigator that he had to use a certain plastering company or risk labor trouble. He was bumping against a wall built long before. when a trucking firm in the garment district failed mysteriously because it refused to join a certain association. Its owner was paying for decisions made decades earlier, when Gagliano and his peers stitched control of that entire zone together. The Bronx itself had changed by then. Elevated trains rattled over different routes. New highways cut across old neighborhoods. Some streets where he had walked no longer existed in the same form, but the influence he had placed there moved with the people. When families left tenements for Queens or Westchester, some rackets followed, adapting to new landscapes. A union local that once dominated jobs in older buildings now handled work in fresh apartment towers. The names on the membership cards changed, yet the pattern of who really chose the leadership often did not. Law enforcement slowly learned to think in those long lines instead of just short bursts. Detectives who once focused only on a single stabbing or a single shakedown began gathering evidence on whole patterns of intimidation. Federal agents looked at shipping routes and contract histories over years, not months. With that longer view, they could see how stable the structures were that he and other early bosses had left behind. In 1963, when Joseph Valachi described the inner workings of the mafia on national television, he provided something that reports and suspicions could not: a clear narrative from someone who had taken the oath and risen inside the system. He told the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations about rituals of induction, coded terms, and the 5 basic New York families. When he named the heads from earlier decades, he did not need to explain who they were to the men questioning him. Researchers in the background had already prepared dossiers. His description of the Bronx-based family's early leadership confirmed what they suspected. First Riene, then after the war, the cautious Sicilian who kept his voice low and his circle tight, Tommy Gagliano. Valachi did not romanticize him. He presented him as part of an older generation, one of the mustache Petes, whose methods emphasized business and calm over flash and constant warfare. Still, in naming him on the record, Valachi shifted him from rumor to acknowledged figure in the official story of American organized crime. As the 1960s and 70s unfolded, new waves of corruption cases pulled on those old threads. Senate hearings starring Robert F. Kennedy looked closely at union misuse and links between labor officials and crime figures. The Teamsters drew much of the attention, but other unions, especially in construction and the garment trades, appeared in supporting roles. Behind some of their more entrenched abuses lay the blueprint laid down by earlier racketeers: capture the leadership, steer contracts, punish dissenters, and use pension funds as private cash reservoirs. Courts began to see indictments that described conspiracies going back to at least a certain year, often a date falling squarely inside his years as boss. These documents did not accuse a dead man, they targeted living defendants. Yet prosecutors framed those cases as part of a longer story, one in which the Bronx family, later called the Lucchese family, had treated certain unions and companies as a permanent base of power. Journalists also delved into that. History, reporters for New York papers, and later for specialized crime columns and books, pieced together accounts of how the garment district's trucks had been cornered, how building supply firms had been steered, how lenders and bookmakers had woven themselves into the daily lives of working neighborhoods. When they tracked those patterns fully, they kept reaching into the 1930s and 40s, into the time when Gagliano had shaped his crew's identity. Writers described him as low-key, shadowy, enigmatic. That wasn't romantic language. It reflected real frustration. There were few surviving photographs and almost no direct quotes. Most of what they knew came secondhand, from later gangsters who mentioned him with respect, from police memos summarizing informant whispers, from immigration and census records that placed him in specific addresses at specific times. One such record showed him living in East Harlem in the 1920s, listed simply with an occupation like truck driver or businessman. Another placed him later in New Jersey, recorded like any other homeowner. On paper, he looked forgettable. If a neighbor had pulled his name from a mailbox, nothing about it would have signaled that federal agents in downtown offices considered him a key figure in one of the nation's most lasting criminal organizations. That contrast fascinated later researchers. They compared him with more flamboyant figures whose photographs filled tabloids. Men in tailored coats leaving nightclubs, men dragged into court in handcuffs, men surrounded by bodyguards. Many of those attention seekers fell hard, shot in restaurants, convicted in sweeping prosecutions, or pushed aside in sudden internal coups. The careful boss from Corleone, by contrast, died in his own bed after a quiet old age, never forced onto a witness stand, never paraded in chains before news cameras. Looking back, some analysts saw in that outcome a lesson about risk. By staying focused on labor racketeering, gambling, and loans, and by steering clear of the most explosive trades and the loudest personal habits, he had made it difficult for any one case to bring him down. Instead of being tied directly to a shooting or a drug ring, he was tied to long-term patterns of pressure and skimming that took years to uncover and required complex financial proof. That doesn't mean he was invisible at the time. Within his own circles, his authority was clear. His name carried weight among other bosses. When the commission made adjustments to territorial lines or responded to a dispute between families, his view mattered. Locally, his people were feared and obeyed, but the idea of celebrity criminal did not appeal to him. He cultivated the opposite, a reputation for being almost boring to outsiders, even as he quietly influenced who worked, who prospered, and who stayed afraid. In Italian-American neighborhoods, views of men like him shifted over generations. During his lifetime, some residents saw groups like his as a harsh but familiar presence, partly filling gaps left by prejudice and weak formal protections. In the early 1900s, police did not always treat Italian immigrant communities fairly. Courts often felt distant and hostile. When someone owed money or faced a threat, it could seem easier to appeal to a local strongman who spoke their language and shared their background, even if that strongman demanded his own price. But as time went on, as children and grandchildren of immigrants became lawyers, teachers, and elected officials, patience for that arrangement wore thin. Community activists in the 1960s and 70s argued that criminal control over unions and neighborhoods held their people back, reducing chances for honest businesses to grow and keeping fear alive long after outright discrimination had begun to ease. They marched, organized, and worked with reform-minded officials to wrest certain institutions away from mob influence. In some cases, they succeeded. Federal oversight or court-appointed trustees took over troubled locals, breaking long monopolies. Investigations exposed sweetheart contracts and ghost jobs. New leadership in some unions tried to distance themselves from any connection to the old ways. Yet in other corners, the habits he had introduced proved stubborn. Entire generations had grown up assuming that certain decisions were never truly open. Who got a slot on a big job? Which firm received a contract? How loans were arranged on the side? By the 1980s, when the federal government brought the commission case against the sitting bosses of New York's 5 families, prosecutors built part of their argument on rackets born in his time. They described how the families cooperated to divide control of building contracts, how they pressured concrete suppliers and developers, how they used shared control over key unions to coordinate profits. Although he had been dead more than 30 years, courtroom diagrams of that system owed a great deal to the framework he helped design with his peers in the 1930s. In that trial and others, the family that once bore his name was represented by its later leaders. But each time an expert witness explained its history, Gagliano's tenure appeared, however briefly. The quiet boss who took over after the Castellammare War rooted his group in labor and trucking, and kept it relatively steady and united until his death. If the Lucchese family ranked among the most stable of the New York groups in the mid-20th century, Much of that steadiness flowed from habits he set. By then, academics were also writing broader histories of organized crime in America. They placed his life in a wider pattern shared by other immigrants who had arrived poor and ambitious at the turn of the century. Many from such backgrounds chose ordinary paths: factory work, small shops, steady trades. A much smaller number, facing limited options and attracted by quicker gains, stepped into criminal networks that blended old country traditions with new world opportunities. For those chroniclers, Gagliano represented a particular type within that smaller group: businesslike, risk-averse, more interested in influence than spectacle. They contrasted him with men who acted like warlords, relying on constant displays of force. They noted that while his approach reduced bloodshed compared to some eras, it also made criminal power harder to uproot, because it became so entangled with legitimate life. If he ever reflected on that near the end of his days, there is no record of it. He left no memoir, no letters beyond the sort any immigrant might send about family news or money matters. The closest anyone gets to his inner world are offhand remarks remembered by men who visited his house or sat with him in small clubs. That the city had changed, that the new generation was impatient, that staying alive in their line of work required a certain slowness. What can be said with confidence is that the structures he built lingered long after his pulse stopped. Decades of court cases, reforms, and internal upheavals have weakened or broken many of those networks. Some unions once deeply compromised have regained independence. Some businesses once held in a stranglehold now operate with real competition. Yet the memory of that earlier period lives on in legal precedents, in organizational charts, and in the cautionary tales passed among those who study how power, when hidden, can grow quietly until it seems almost normal. Tommy Gagliano never sought fame. His greatest comfort, by all evidence, was being underestimated by those outside his world. That strategy worked well for him personally. He avoided the early graves and long prison terms that claimed so many of his peers. But the cost of his success fell on others, on workers whose unions were denied honest leadership, on contractors forced into protection schemes, on communities where fear dulled civic life for years. His story, pieced together from scattered records and reluctant memories, shows that the consequences of a single life can spread in ways even the person living it might not fully grasp. What he began in the coal yards and ice depots of the Bronx reached courtrooms and legislative chambers he never entered. Long after his funeral ended and his family walked away from his grave, people who never heard his name still felt the echoes of his choices, in ways large and small, through the systems he left behind. When people in New York talked about mob bosses in the 1970s and 80s, his name almost never came up first. They mentioned figures who were still alive, still being followed by reporters, still getting their pictures taken coming out of court. Yet in offices where investigators and historians dug into older records, Tommy Gagliano's name kept surfacing quietly, like a faint watermark on page after page. By that time, most of the men who had dealt with him directly were gone or very old. A few had given interviews late in life, talking cautiously about the early days, usually without dwelling on him for long. What they did say followed a pattern. They described him as serious, measured, not given to emotional displays. Some called him old school, someone who preferred conversation and arrangements to open shows of force. None of them pretended he was harmless. They understood that the calm at the surface sat on top of very real threats. Court files from the 1960s and later, especially those involving the Lucchese family, often opened with a short summary of background. In a few paragraphs, prosecutors would explain how that organization had developed, starting with Riene, then passing through Gagliano, then on to Lucchese. Those lines were not meant to tell his full story. They were there to show judges and juries that the schemes they were examining had roots that went back far beyond the particular defendant on trial. When prosecutors charged union officials in the garment industry with extortion, They laid out how for years factory owners had been told to use approved trucking companies, how strike threats appeared and vanished in ways that matched underworld interests, how benefit funds had been steered. Behind those patterns lay the structure his era had solidified, the blending of legitimate companies, corrupted union officers, and the constant possibility of industrial trouble if someone refused to cooperate. The list of activities that flourished under that model was long. Extortion took many forms. Factory owners paying security assessments to avoid unexplained work stoppages. Small businesses buying supplies from particular wholesalers to keep peace with local representatives. Lathing and plastering contractors agreeing to partner with certain firms instead of others, even when the prices were higher, because they knew who backed those firms. Loan sharking remained another key piece. Workers and shopkeepers who gambled or simply fell behind on bills often found mainstream banks closed to them, especially in earlier decades when credit was harder to obtain. That gap left them vulnerable. In neighborhoods where his people operated, word spread that money could be found quickly if you knew whom to ask. The repayment schedule, though, was brutal. High weekly or monthly interest meant a borrower who slipped even once could find the debt swelling faster than they could pay it down. Collectors enforcing those debts made sure people understood that non-payment was not an option. Illegal gambling, too, stayed central. Numbers games in poor districts, unlicensed card rooms in back spaces of bars or social clubs, off-the-books betting on sports events. These all gave his organization steady income with relatively limited upfront investment. Runners took wagers, small-time operators handled daily payouts, and the central figures collected a percentage. If someone tried to open a game without permission in an area his family considered theirs, pressure followed. That might begin with a visit and a warning. If ignored, the game might be robbed, equipment smashed, or the organizer beaten. These steps sent a clear message: unsanctioned operations would not be allowed. Labor racketeering remained the backbone. In building trades, the combination of union influence, control over certain companies, and the cooperation or fear of developers allowed his group to skim from large projects almost invisibly. Winning a major contract often required paying off someone within the chain his people controlled. Once the project began, additional costs could be added through padded hours, ghost employees, or inflated material bills. Each extra bit was small enough to be brushed off as normal waste, unless you knew how many such small increases had been built into the system. All of these activities had long outlived him by the time major federal laws were written to fight them. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO, passed in 1970, was shaped in part by the realization that traditional criminal laws were not enough. Prosecutors could jail a loan shark, a bookmaker, or a violent enforcer for a few years, but the larger structure stayed intact, run by leaders who kept their names off papers and their hands off the dirtiest work. RICO allowed authorities to charge those leaders not just for isolated acts, but for participating in an ongoing enterprise that committed a pattern of crimes. It acknowledged what people like Gagliano had demonstrated in practice, that organized crime was less about individual robberies or assaults and more about sustained control over sectors of the economy. The law did not mention him, of course, but it answered a problem his career had helped define. As RICO cases started to appear in the 1970s and 80s, press coverage often focused on contemporary bosses. Yet in the background, investigators preparing those cases walked back through old arrangements. They examined how the garment trucking system had been parceled out among families. They traced which construction unions had been considered belonging to which groups. They noted how long-standing habits of kickbacks and bid manipulation had survived leadership changes. Whenever they asked how such stable arrangements had been set in place, the trail led back to the period when he was in charge. The Riene family had been present during the earliest outlines of organized control over labor. The Gagliano years had converted loose influence into a more systematic approach, especially in the Bronx and garment trades. That continuity was one of the reasons his organization, under later names and leaders, remained one of the most successful in labor racketeering for so long. Inside Italian-American communities, efforts to fight both crime and harmful stereotypes gathered strength. Activists pointed out that the vast majority of families from those backgrounds had pursued entirely legitimate paths, running shops, working trades, entering professions. They argued that high-profile coverage of mob figures distorted reality, making it seem as if criminal bosses represented their culture, when in fact they were a tiny minority. At the same time, some of those activists pressed hard to break whatever remained of the influence he and others had left. Community groups supported reform candidates in union elections, demanded transparency over pension funds, and urged witnesses to cooperate with law enforcement in specific cases of extortion or intimidation. For them, men like Gagliano were not mysterious legends, but obstacles whose decisions had slowed the progress of their neighborhoods. Cultural portrayals of organized crime rarely featured him by name. Films and novels tended to favor more dramatic personalities, bosses who shouted, who wore attention-grabbing suits, who paraded in front of cameras. Still, careful viewers and readers could find traces of his type, a calm, older man in the background, uninterested in nightclubs, focused on contracts and quiet control, in composite characters drawn from multiple real figures. Crime writers who dug deeper sometimes used him as an example of how much influence could rest with someone who almost never appeared in the news. They contrasted his low-key handling of power with the impulsive actions of later men whose temper or ego drew them into unnecessary confrontations. In their accounts, the years when he led the family appeared as a period of relative stability, especially compared with the more turbulent eras that followed under different bosses. For his own relatives, the legacy was more complex. He had a wife, children, and extended family, though public records reveal little about their private lives. Some likely tried to live as far from his world as possible, choosing ordinary careers in suburbs where no one knew their connection. Others may have stayed closer, benefiting, directly or indirectly, from the money and status his position brought. Children of powerful men in that world often carried a burden, the expectation from some quarters that they would continue the line, and the suspicion from outsiders that they could never truly separate themselves. Because he died before the era of televised hearings and long investigative documentaries, his family was spared some of the public glare that later mob relatives endured. There were no news crews parked outside their doors, no tabloids running their pictures next to lurid headlines. The cost for them came mainly in whispers and private knowledge, the awareness that their husband or father had lived a secret life that depended on fear, and the uncertainty over how much of that would touch them even after he was gone. For scholars studying the immigrant experience, his story sat at an uneasy intersection. On one hand, he followed a pattern seen among many who arrived with nothing: hard labor, gradual improvement in status, adaptation to a new country's opportunities. On the other, he chose a path that twisted that story, turning shared hardships into tools for manipulation. He used the tight bonds of community, shared language, shared origin, shared struggle, to build a network where loyalty became a weapon against both rivals and innocent outsiders. Understanding his choices meant looking not only at his personal character, but at the environment he grew up in. Corleone, with its history of distrust toward formal authority, taught children to rely on family and local men of respect, rather than distant officials. Early 20th century New York presented new versions of that lesson: prejudice from police, poor treatment in courts, landlords and bosses who saw recent immigrants as expendable. In such settings, turning to strong local figures might have seemed like protection at first. Over time, that form of protection hardened into domination. The harm he caused, measured across decades, is easier to grasp in hindsight than it would have been to men on the street in his time. A carpenter hired for under-the-table work here, a shopkeeper paying a small monthly fee there, a contractor agreeing to one padded bill. It all seemed like part of the rough way business was done. Only later did people tally how much money had been siphoned away from open competition, how many chances for honest growth had been choked off, how many workers' voices had been muted inside unions that no longer truly served them. In archives and university libraries, someone tracing these patterns can now pull out a stack of materials: FBI summaries, Senate transcripts, old newspaper clippings, academic studies. Each source adds a bit more to the outline of his role. None of them bring him into focus the way a detailed diary or tape recording would. He remains, in large part, a silhouette defined by the shape of the system around him. Even that silhouette, though, teaches something. It shows how an individual with a certain temperament, cautious, patient, more manager than showman, can have enormous impact, especially when operating in a setting where oversight is weak and fear keeps people silent. It also shows how long that impact can last. He died in 1951, but into the late 20th century and even beyond, court cases and reform efforts were still wrestling with arrangements his era had embedded. In the neighborhoods where his story began, the reminders of that time have grown faint. Many of the old social clubs have closed. Younger residents walk past buildings that once housed backroom card games or union offices without knowing what deals were made there. The ice and coal yards that formed his first base of power are gone, replaced by supermarkets, apartment blocks, or parking lots. On some streets, though, older residents still remember hearing their parents mention a name like his in low voices, often paired with a phrase like "in those days," or "you didn't ask questions." For them, the distance between then and now is measured not just in years, but in a sense of how their city has changed, from a place where certain men's wishes seemed absolute to one where those old pressures, if not entirely erased, at least no longer dominate daily life in the same way. The story of Tommy Gagliano lives there now, in that mixture of half-remembered caution and thoroughly documented history. It is preserved in thick binders and digital files, in the footnotes of books on labor history and organized crime, and in the quiet understanding among those who study such things that some of the most influential figures are the ones whose names hardly anyone knew while they were alive. In the city he once helped shape from the shadows, the nights feel different now. The elevated trains still screech around tight bends, taxis still honk in long lines, delivery trucks still rumble through dawn. But the old networks that linked so many of those sounds together have thinned. Some have been broken by courts and reform, some have faded as generations changed, and some have simply slipped out of fashion as new kinds of crime and new technologies appeared. Yet if you look closely at the history, you can still see the path of one quiet man running underneath it all like a buried cable. It begins in a hillside village in Sicily, crosses the Atlantic in a crowded ship's hold, runs through East Harlem cellars stacked with coal and ice, slips into back rooms during Prohibition, and then spreads through union halls, freight depots, and construction sites. That line belongs to Tommy Gagliano, and even long after his funeral, its outline helps explain why New York's economy twisted in certain ways during the middle of the 20th century. Today, someone standing in Corleone might find it hard to imagine that a boy born there more than a century ago would one day sit quietly among the people who designed the American mob's basic structure. The town has changed since his childhood. Modern traffic, tourists, and a different kind of public attention have arrived, especially after films and novels made its name famous among people who have never set foot in Sicily. But in the years when he was a child, it was a small place of stone houses and dirt paths, where local reputation mattered more than any distant law. That world taught him early to weigh his words, and to watch which adults other people seemed to fear or respect. Formal schooling was short. Learning came mostly from observation: who spoke in public, who settled disputes, who could get a favor done with a few quiet phrases. These lessons did not force him toward crime. Most children raised around him chose other ways. But the habit of relying on personal authority rather than institutions settled deep into him before he ever saw New York. When he joined the stream of migrants heading to America, his expectations were modest. The letters that reached Corleone from cousins abroad spoke of crowded tenements, hard work, and wages that were still better than what the rocky fields at home could offer. He didn't leave imagining himself a future boss. He left thinking about survival. On the Lower East Side and in East Harlem, survival often meant taking the first job offered. He hauled, drove, and delivered. Those early tasks put him close to the city's lifeblood: coal for stoves, ice for food storage, goods for small shops. While others saw only heavy loads and long hours, he noticed something else: the patterns. Who controlled the best routes? Which shops always seemed nervous? Which foremen talked too quietly when certain visitors stopped by? In that setting, his slide into the underworld did not begin with a dramatic oath. It began with errands and favors, with introductions to men who already had one foot outside the law. First came small assignments: carrying a message, checking on a payment, making sure a rival understood that certain streets were already spoken for. These were not yet the roles of a leader, but they were steps away from ordinary life. As he moved closer to the R&A group in the Bronx, the things he did took clearer shape. He helped manage protection schemes around coal and ice distribution. That meant making sure shop owners paid regular sums so that their supplies arrived on time and undamaged. Those who cooperated found their deliveries smooth. Those who resisted sometimes faced delays, broken stock, or other forms of trouble that never came with a written explanation. He supported bootlegging operations during Prohibition. His trucks, which already traveled familiar routes, became carriers for illegal alcohol concealed among legitimate cargo. He didn't brew the liquor himself. His role was to coordinate movements, organize drivers, and keep the flow steady. Doing that well required planning, secrecy, and the nerve to keep going while knowing that discovery could mean prison or worse. He also helped his group gain leverage in unions. In the early building trades, that meant backing certain candidates for leadership, discouraging rivals through intimidation, and gradually turning some locals into tools for steering contracts. When a contractor signed agreements with those unions, they weren't just negotiating hours and wages. They were, often unknowingly, entering a web where decisions at the top were influenced by people like him. When rivals appeared, other groups, independent gamblers, uncooperative trucking companies, he played a part in pushing them aside. Sometimes this was done through negotiation or offers too good to refuse, shared profits in exchange for giving up autonomy. Other times, more forceful tactics were used. Equipment might get damaged. An independent operator might be warned in a way that left no doubt about the danger of continuing. In extreme cases, violence ended careers permanently. He rarely held the weapon, but as one of the men giving orders, he bore responsibility for the climate that made those outcomes possible. As years passed and the R&A family turned into the Gagliano family under his control, his criminal portfolio broadened. He oversaw gambling dens in back rooms and social clubs, where dice, cards, and numbers games took money from hopeful players each night. He allowed loan operations that targeted the desperate and the reckless, lending cash at interest rates that quickly trapped borrowers in a cycle of fear. He maintained grip over trucking routes in the garment district, pressing factories to use approved carriers and punishing those who tried to shop around. All of this happened while he cultivated an outward image that looked anything but dramatic. To neighbors, he was a middle-aged man going about his business, later an older man taking careful walks. He didn't decorate his home like a palace. He didn't race expensive cars down crowded avenues. That contrast between public appearance and private reality was one of the reasons he lasted as long as he did. The longer he survived, the more deeply he and his associates sank into the city's fabric. By the time he took his last breath, His influence touched everything from the cost of concrete on a new building to the fate of a small garment factory trying to expand. Those ties did not vanish when he died. Others stepped into his place, inheriting the networks he had overseen. When later generations of investigators tried to untangle those networks, they found that many roads led back to the same period, those interwar decades when he and a handful of other bosses had divided labor territories, settled on cooperative habits, and agreed to avoid pointless public wars. Their compromise after the Castellammers conflict laid the foundation for a system that endured longer than anyone at those meetings could have predicted. Looking at his story from this distance, it's tempting to try to reduce it to a single lesson, that crime doesn't pay, or that quiet people can be dangerous, or that power built on fear eventually crumbles. There is truth in each of those ideas, but his life resists simple slogans. On a personal level, crime did pay for him in the sense that he escaped long prison terms and lived out his old age with material comfort. Unlike many of his peers, he was not shot in a restaurant or caught in a hail of bullets on a street corner. He did not spend decades behind bars. In the narrow sense of avoiding the worst endings, his caution served him well. Yet if you step back and measure cost in a different currency, the picture shifts. The system he helped build took money from countless people who had few other options. It distorted unions that should have existed to raise workers' voices, turning them into instruments of control. It limited which firms could truly compete for contracts, slowing innovation and keeping some honest businesses small when they might have grown. Those are losses spread so widely they are hard to see in one place, but added together, they are substantial. There is also the private cost that doesn't show up in court files. The strain of living a double life, the constant need to guard one's words, the knowledge that trust extended only so far and that betrayal could come from a man you had known for years. A person might become accustomed to that tension, but it still takes something from him over time. In his later years, as he delegated more and more to others, there were hints that the weight of decades had become heavy even for him. The city he left behind has tried in many ways to move beyond that era. Laws like RICO, independent oversight of unions, and more careful monitoring of public contracts all grew in part as responses to the structures he and his peers created. Journalists, scholars, and community leaders have worked to make sure people understand how deeply organized crime once reached into daily life, so that complacency does not allow similar patterns to reappear unnoticed. At the same time, the old stories have drifted into legend. Films and television shows present stylized versions of bosses and soldiers, sometimes glamorous, sometimes monstrous, rarely accurate in their full complexity. In those portrayals, a figure like him tends to be simplified, either erased in favor of flashier personalities or turned into a generic, quiet don, whose real history is barely hinted at. The truth is both more ordinary and more troubling. He was not a mythical genius or a cartoon villain. He was a man with a particular temperament, born into a specific time and place, who found in organized crime a path that rewarded his patience and caution. He used those traits to build a hidden power that helped him, and those close to him, at the expense of many others who had little say in the matter. Knowing this does not mean excusing him. It means recognizing that the line between survival and exploitation, between protecting one's own and preying on others, can blur for people who convince themselves they are simply working within the way things are. In his youth, the way things are included landlords who abused tenants, bosses who underpaid workers, and officials who ignored certain neighborhoods. Men like him stepped into that space and told themselves they were bringing order, even as they built a different kind of harm. Tonight, if someone in New York is lying in bed, listening to the distant hum of trucks and the occasional wail of a siren, they are hearing echoes of systems that have changed but not disappeared. Commerce still moves in patterns, some fair, some crooked. The lesson from his life is not that such patterns can ever be fully erased, but that they can be seen, questioned, and challenged in ways that were harder in his time. In a small room somewhere, a student might be reading an old Senate report, tracing his name with a fingertip as they learn how a man they never heard of before helped design part of their city's hidden wiring. In another place, a retired union member might remember when a new wave of leadership finally shook off the old pressures and allowed votes to matter again. These quiet, scattered acts of remembering and reform are part of the answer to the world he helped shape. Back in Corleone, the streets where he once walked as a child are now walked by others who know his name only because they have read about far-off crime stories or watched films inspired by that world. Some may feel a strange pride in the international attention their town has received. Others feel only sorrow or frustration that a handful of men, across generations, dragged their birthplace into a reputation it did not ask for. Whatever future those hills and that city carve out for themselves, his story remains a reminder of how the decisions of individuals can bend the fortunes of entire communities. He chose a path that offered him safety and wealth, and that path required extortion, corruption, and the constant use or threat of force by others on his behalf. He did not carry out every act personally, but he benefited from and directed a system where those acts were standard tools. Now, with so much time between his era and ours, his figure seems to stand at a distance, like an old photograph left on a table. The edges are blurred, the details faint, but the shape is still there. A reserved man, rarely smiling in public, surrounded by people who listened closely when he spoke. As the night grows late and the noises of the city settle into a softer rhythm, it's possible to hold his life in mind without either glorifying or dismissing it. He was neither a monster beyond understanding nor a hero of any kind. He was a person whose choices, made step by step over many years, built a structure that served a small circle while quietly injuring many more. Remembering that complexity matters because it keeps us from turning real history into simple tale-ese. His journey, from Corleone to the Bronx, from driver to boss, from feared name and whispers to entry in a history book, shows how much can grow from a mixture of opportunity, fear, ambition, and habit. It also shows how long the shadows of such a life can stretch, reaching into decades he never lived to see. Somewhere far from the noise of his old streets, a reader may now close a book that carries his name in a chapter heading or a footnote. The lights go off. The room falls quiet. Outside, the world he helped shape has moved on, changed by laws, by new waves of immigrants, by different forms of power and different battles. But the trace of him remains, in the caution with which cities now watch for corruption, in the determination of workers to keep their unions clean, in the careful eyes of investigators who know that the most dangerous influences are often the ones that draw the least attention. And in that way, long after his voice went silent and his footsteps faded from the sidewalks of New York, the story of Tommy Gagliano continues, not as a legend to be admired, but as a lesson woven into the broader tale of how a great city learned over time to see and resist the quiet kinds of power that grow in its shadows. And as the night settles once more over the silent empires, we step away from the steady, disciplined world of Tommy Gagliano, a man whose strength lay in patience, order, and the quiet passing of power from one generation to the next. His story lingers softly, like a whisper of old rules and enduring tradition. If this journey helped you unwind or drift toward sleep, remember to like the video, subscribe, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these quiet stories alive. Now let your breathing slow, let the silence deepen, and allow the echoes of history to guide you gently into the night. Good night.